This podcast provides a platform for our guests to express their own personal views and opinions. Some or all of these views and opinions may not be shared by Ben and/or Yoel.
Welcome to the Too Dad to Quit podcast,
the podcast where we highlight stories of dads on the other side of divorce
to inspire and give strength to dads going through it.
I'm Ben.
And I'm Yoel.
Welcome back to the Too Dad to Quit podcast. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Make sure to comment. Those ratings in the podcast platforms is super important. So let's get us up in the rankings in Spotify so we can get the word out to more and more people, as well as Apple Podcasts. Thank you very much. This week, we are sitting with Brian A. Vandiver. He is a father, a divorced father, but more importantly, he's an advocate and a lobbyist. And it's trying to make shared custody kind of the default for parents going through divorce, and not where it matters who's the mother, who's the father. Just equal parenting should be the default in the system. And it's amazing to hear his journey. He's put together a kind of a system, an outline. He gives advice for any of you that want to do this in your state. He has been extremely successful. He's got a big plan. He has great partners. And this is all things he's doing on his spare time while he has his law practice. And I think it's just super insightful, and we got a lot into the system and understanding what is the current state of things. And I think you'll benefit greatly to know what can be done if enough people get together and build a movement that you can actually change things and you're not just stuck with the system as it is today.
Yeah, Ben, you really hit the nail on the head. Brian had his own experiences going through divorce, and he saw what was a playing field that wasn't level, and he actually did something about it. He took action and was able to affect changing the state of the law. And that's had ripple effects for states throughout the United States. And it's really amazing to see what a man can accomplish if he puts his mind to it. And he's got a full life. He's happily remarried. He's got a blended family. He's got a busy law practice. And yet still he was able to take action and make change, which has had a dramatic effect, helping out other dads out there, lowering the amount of litigation cases. And you can listen to what Brian has to say to learn more about just how he went about making that change, and how he was able to take action. And I'm really excited for our audience to hear what Brian has to say.
Yeah, and we talk about it a little bit, but he's one of those guys that I would love to have actually in government, elected, and being able to champion this even more to the rest of the states and make there a real movement, because this is the way it should be. So I present to you Brian Vandiver. Our guest today is Brian A. Vandiver. Brian is an attorney from Arkansas with 3 kids and 2 stepkids. He is also a volunteer lobbyist trying to implement parental equality legislation in the United States, which Arkansas is a leader in the nation on the presumption of joint custody laws. So I've found Brian, looking around Twitter for people kind of on the same mission as us. And I saw how active you were and how proud you were of your work. And that's kind of what drew me to reach out and ask you to be on here, because I know we have, most of our audience is from the States. And so I think your knowledge and the space and even from my own childhood, as my parents got divorced when I was 8 months old. And I remember being in court and the judge asking me when I was 5 years old who I wanted to live with. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. And if there's any way to prevent any kid from going through what I went through, I'm all for it. So we're really happy to have you here.
Hello to you guys. Hello to your audience. And I appreciate the opportunity to visit.
Awesome. So, we always like to find a little bit out about our guests and what got you to who you are today. And, you're definitely a passionate person. I can tell for sure. And, what made you decide to be a lawyer, what your family was like growing up, etc. So we'd love to hear that.
Sure. So I'm 48, born and raised in Arkansas. Went to a high school in East Arkansas in the Delta. Played baseball growing up, so baseball has always been my passion.
Nice,
Went to a
nice.
small liberal arts college called Hendrix College in Arkansas. It's a little north of Little Rock, and then went straight to law school from there at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. So been in Arkansas my entire life, and started practicing law. And really, my practice is employment for mostly the corporate side, the defense side. I do some plaintiffs work, but the majority, overwhelmingly, is corporate defense employment litigation and advice. So it's your typical HR questions like, what do we do with this situation? Wage and hour, discrimination, that type of thing. So I was married in 2001, and then divorced from that marriage in 2016, and we had children. And as a lawyer, you kind of, when you're do the practice I do, and you don't go to family courts ever, you assume all the courts are the same, and the playing field's going to be the same, and the evidentiary standards are going to be interpreted the same. And it was just it was a real shock to me as a lawyer and a party to go through what I went through, having to try to defend myself as a good dad.
Yeah.
So, I was fortunate enough to have, a joint custody resolution. Not a lot of dads get that. And so I am more fortunate than many dads, uh, probably some of your guests that watch your show. So, I kind of, after that experience, in my heart, knew that something had to change. We had to do something. I had to get involved, and really got motivated to become an advocate. And I met Gina and Patrick Fraley, who had formed Arkansas Advocates for Parental Equality. And in 2019, we ran a bill that failed in the Judiciary Committee, and we kind of then at that point came up with a 2-year plan to come back in 2021 with our goal, and we got it across the finish line.
Amazing. And what is in that? I guess you guys kind of want to lead the way of changing, across the country. So what were kind of the main points in?
So Arkansas Act 604, and I encourage all of your viewers to Google it. It's out there, but it is our new law for joint custody, and we are we were the second state to adopt what's called a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 shared parenting. Kentucky was the first, and they adopted their rebuttable presumption in 2018. And for your viewers that don't know legalese, a rebuttable presumption just assumes the fact. It assumes that it exists, and you don't have to prove it with evidence. So it's kind of like a starting point in the law.
Like a default.
Default presumption. And so we went a step further than Kentucky, though, because Kentucky, so for your viewers, burdens of proof that was a big issue for us. And most civil cases, including family courts in Arkansas and the U.S., rely on what's called the preponderance of evidence standard. And that is simply the weight of the evidence, how the scales tip one way or the other with a feather of evidence. And that's all that it takes for a judge to decide most civil cases, including child custody cases. And that's what's required to rebut the presumption in Kentucky. So we wanted to go a step further than that. And we adopted what's called a clear and convincing evidence standard. And that is a burden of proof between preponderance of evidence and what the criminal courts use as beyond reasonable doubt. Most
Mhm.
people are familiar with that standard.
Right.
So clear and convincing is kind of that intermediate standard between those, and you've got to have real strong evidence to overcome that. And we felt that standard was appropriate and necessary, because that's the standard that the U.S. Supreme Court requires for states to meet to take children away in parental termination cases when they're terminating parental rights, right? So that's to protect your fundamental right as a parent when the state gets involved. And we wanted to use that same standard in child custody litigation to protect parental rights in those cases.
And that's the Arkansas State Supreme Court or the Supreme Court?
That's the U.S. Supreme Court
Okay.
established that in 1982. The case is Santosky v. Kramer, I believe. And I encourage your viewers and you to read that, because it's a really good read about the fundamental right of a parent under the U.S. Constitution, and the due process rights that a parent has when to raise your children. And so before that case, a lot of states only used the preponderance of evidence standard when states were seeking to terminate parental rights. So that case kind of made all the states say, no, you have to use clear and convincing evidence before you can do that. And that's 40 years ago.
Right.
So Brian, I just want to ask you, and this could be because it's 12:15 a.m. here in the Middle East where I am. So, but there could be some viewers out there. I just want to try and put it back to like you were saying, layman's terms, or to keep it simple. What would somebody expect, let's say, prior to the work that you've done in terms of changing the legislation? What would a dad, to use that example, expect when he was walking into court in such a litigation case versus what he could expect now? Can you sort of put it in,
Sure.
in example terms? Yeah.
Yeah. So, in most cases, and a lot of cases before the law changed, it was kind of, even though the law says that the sex isn't a factor, it was always a factor. And in practice, we had a lot of old judges that would award custody to moms, primary custody or sole custody. And the stats show that not only from our state, from states all across the U.S., that 80 to 90% of primary custody decisions go to mom. So to change that dynamic, I mean, dads from the outset, before the law changed, were kind of on the playing defense. You had to prove something above and beyond that moms just didn't have to prove, that you were fit and capable of sharing joint custody. And the other dynamic is that a lot of judges just did not want to award joint custody in our state. They kind of had this, even though our law from 2013 said we favored it, they just had this predisposition against awarding joint custody, particularly in cases where the parents could not necessarily
Work it
get
out
along all
themselves.
the time, or they're arguing. There's any kind of conflict, the judges would use that as a reason to say, oh, they can't get along, so we're not going to award joint custody, which it's an easy scapegoat, because any parents who are in litigation are going to have some conflict. So
Right.
it's just you can't say that there's not going to be any conflict. That's just the nature of litigation. So what we did with our law is to kind of reduce some of that, and we had some specific wording to address that point, to say before the judge can do something different than joint custody, the judge has to try to work out the conflict in the judge's order, to resolve the conflict before destroying joint custody. So whether that's giving dad decisions on schools and mom decisions on medical or something like that, as a hypothetical, the judge has to try to work out that conflict in orders, if possible, before destroying joint custody.
So tell me if I got this right, Brian. It was always the case, correct me if I'm wrong, it was always the case that by law, the judges should be looking at, and again, I'm just trying to put this in simple terms, the judge should be looking at the mother and father equally when deciding on custody, but in reality, the judges were not necessarily, or in your opinion, weren't doing that at all, or not as much as they should, whereas now, thanks to your legislation, a judge may still have a predisposition. Like, we can't change what's in the mindset of a person, but they have a higher accountability based on the standard you've now put into place by the legislation. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Not only do they have a higher accountability, but I think there's been an awareness and education brought out by the publicity of our new law, and just not only education among the judges and the judiciary, but the lawyers and the public as well. Now, everyone knows that the law has changed dramatically, and there is now a new starting point. So, before each parent had to prove that they were worthy and fit, now we're going to assume both parents are fit unless there's clear evidence otherwise. And, we're talking about drugs or abuse or something of that nature where there's a real legitimate problem.
Did you have opposition? I want to ask you, Ben, I don't want to steal the show here, but
it's okay. That's why I invited you here.
I'm very curious about this. So I want to ask you about the anatomy of how you go about making such a change. I think that would be very interesting. I'm certainly interested.
Well,
Curious about if you had opposition to it as well. So it's kind of two-point question.
Yeah, we had huge opposition. So, we wanted to reach for that clear and convincing standard of proof because we knew, and I knew as a lawyer, how dramatic it would be and how important it would be to change the dynamic of litigation. And so that was our goal, to do that. And like I said, we're the only state so far to do it. I know Ohio's trying to do it. They're going to have a bill that's going to drop here in the next couple of days. They had one last year that was House Bill 508 that got stuck in committee, but they're going to try again with clear and convincing evidence. There are some other states that will try again, I think. But yeah, our opposition was mainly from the judges and the family lawyers. And they formally came out and opposed this change on record. And we were fortunate enough to have strong legislators that just didn't give that much weight.
What was their reasoning as far as you understand? Like, what were they saying was their reason to oppose it?
Well, I think from the judicial standpoint, their arguments were that, we've done it this way for 100 years. It's always been the best interest of the child. The judges need the discretion to make these decisions on an individualized basis. They know the facts best, all the same arguments that we hear all the time. And, my rebuttal to that was, well, if what we've been doing hasn't worked, then why would we keep doing it that way? Because clearly we're not getting the results that we want. We have a lot of fathers that are being excluded unnecessarily from custody situations. So why would we keep using that same paradigm if we're not getting the results that we want? And let's do something different. And of course, the lawyers, the family lawyers, they would never say this, but they were afraid of the dramatic reduction in litigation.
Right.
And from all accounts that I've talked to in the past year plus, there has been a significant drop in custody litigation. Not the number of cases, because you're not going to reduce the number of divorces or the number of paternities filed, but it's that amount of time that it takes litigating those issues and fighting about custody. So I've heard from a number of lawyers and a number of judges who have all said the new law has greatly simplified that process.
And does this law have any effect on child support and things like that? Because it is 50-50 by default?
Well, not directly, but child support is determined by how much time you spend with, how much custody time you have. And so we have a formula in Arkansas that takes into account if you have, over 141 custodial nights a year, then you're going to get some type of offset, and you're not going to pay as much. Now you can still have 50-50 custody and pay, because we have an income share model currently. But generally, if both parents are making about the same amount of money and they're sharing equal custody, most judges I'm familiar with are not going to order child support.
That's amazing. And do you have a plan to, are you people consulting you from other states? Are you the guy now?
Yes. I'm not the guy, but I'm one I'm in a group of connected individuals who are trying to advocate and use Arkansas and Kentucky, and West Virginia was the third state to adopt a rebuttable presumption in last year in 2022. So I'm trying to reach out, and have told any state who has a similar bill, I'm happy to visit with, speak on behalf of any legislation. So yes, I'm going to be working with Ohio this year and some other states to try to get similar bills passed.
And is it easier on the state level than to do something federal, or federal doesn't have any impact on these cases?
Well, in the U.S., all of these decisions are made at the state level. As far as custody decisions, the only impact really from the federal level would be what we call the Title IV defunding. That is a supplement to the child support that the states collect. And so from that aspect, to get anything done at the federal level in the U.S. is impossible.
Yeah.
But this is more of a state by state approach, because each state has its own law with regard to child custody and how custody decisions are made. So
Right.
we're just trying to identify states that are kind of in that top tier of targets for 2023, and take them one at a time.
And what makes them a top tier? Are there like a specific criteria? Like their laws are pretty close, they're just not almost there, or they've got the right people in the house? Or...
I think a combination of all of that. You've got to consider first, what is the current political climate in that state, and is there going to be an appetite for this? What is their current law? How easily is it going to be to change it, and what type of opposition are you going to see? So, we are just a deep red state in Arkansas. We had a very conservative legislature. I think if you go to another state that's a real blue state, you might get a lot more opposition from, say, domestic violence groups and things of that nature. So it just depends. The politics of it are interesting, because this issue doesn't necessarily cut red and blue. We had no, and it shouldn't. We had a lot of Democrat support for our bill, particularly from minority fathers who were legislators in our House and Senate, who saw the importance of this and supported it. And so we had a good crossover vote from them. And then, of course, we lost some female Republican votes because they just didn't like what it did. So,
yeah, there's a stat I talk about a lot, which is kind of like 80% of divorces nowadays are being filed by the woman. So I don't know. If that stat is accurate, then this can be life-changing for many, many men, because I know I have several friends that just haven't seen their kids for a long time in the States, or it's just too much to do it, or they have to get on level footing, they have to have supervised visits. Just that whole comeback from behind experience is demeaning, right, and deteriorating. which is another reason we started the podcast, because, just to show men that have made it through whatever that experience is and still have a relationship with their kids and how important it is. So even though the middle sucks, but that maintaining that relationship or finally getting that relationship is so important, and important for your kids, to be
Well, I
productive.
tell you, the work that you guys are doing, Ben and Yoel, it's just phenomenal, and it's so important to have podcasts like this as a resource for men, because men who go through this challenge really, um, society doesn't recognize the hurdles that a lot of men like us face, and sometimes men get lost and don't have the support they need, particularly when it comes to the relationship with their children. Because I know, and I'm sure you know, that there's nothing more important than that. And so when you get that taken away from you, or even the threat of it being taken away from you, it can turn what was a very normal dad into someone who is not thinking straight, and you can get lost easily in depression and other things. So I commend you for your work.
Appreciate that, Brian. And let me ask you, like, if you're open to talking about it, like what helped you? I want to get back to like how the actual change of legislation looks like, because I am curious, and I'm sure there are people that want to take action wherever they are. Anybody out there listening, they don't know how to start. So I want to get to that, but I do want to ask you, because this was a good segue in terms of your experience. Like, was there something that you were able to turn to? Like, was it getting yourself involved in making this change that helped, sort of push you and keep you level-headed? Like, what helped you get through it?
A lot of things, just kind of, I think getting involved, being an advocate, finding some passion as an outlet certainly helped a lot. Um, I reconnected, with some old friends that I hadn't seen in a long time, and kind of rekindled some of those relationships. Partly because I wanted to, and partly because, as many of your viewers may know, when you go through divorce, you lose a lot of relationships and friendships. So
Oh yeah.
it's important. It's important to have friendships and people that you can talk to and rely upon, as a dad, as a father. Spent a lot of time with my own dad, just kind of talking about, um, how he raised me, and how important it was to me to have that relationship, and still is. And then, of course, I've been a fisherman my whole life, and bass fisherman in the South. So I had lost kind of that um, hobby, and in the past couple of years, particularly, I've kind of connected with that. And so just being outdoors and doing something you love, is helpful.
Awesome.
And your parents are married, divorced?
They are both still married. They married, and I was born a year later, and they are still married. So closing in on 50 years for them.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I it's that whole thing about reaching out and losing friendships and gaining friendships or refinding friendships. It's kind of like you're left at kind of square one again after the divorce, and you're trying to figure out what what now. And there is a lot of that. I'm going to go back to what I used to know, because I lost some of it along the way. Was that sort of the same feeling you were having? Just as opposed to
Yeah, I mean,
starting from scratch, it's a lot easier to go,
yeah, some good friends from high school and college, that were there before the marriage and have always been there, but you kind of lost touch with, and so reconnected with some of them, um, and then made new friends, just through uh, dads groups, advocacy, that have similar experiences. Other dads that go to their children go to school with my children, and we connected just over common issues. So it's tough, and I've been in the valley many times and just thought, man, how am I going to get through this? But I would encourage all of your viewers, just hang in there, not for yourself, but for your kids, because they that's what's important.
No, I wanted to jump forward because now, you're remarried, you met someone. Um, how was that process?
It's been phenomenal. She's amazing. Her name's Sarah. We were married in December 2019, and this is our blended family behind me. So she has two, I have three, and yeah, it's kind of a crazy madhouse when all the kids are here, but it's fun and it's and then we have weekends when it's just the two of us. So
Nice. How did you guys meet? I'm assuming it wasn't an app, but maybe I'm wrong.
it was online. Yeah, we met online, and
Nice.
she's 9 years younger, so we didn't really have a lot of hardly any mutual friends. And so I kind of wanted someone outside of the old circles that I was familiar with, and just someone new, completely different. And I think it was kind of, that kind of love at first sight. And from day one, our first date, we've been together. So
Oh. And she's local also, Arkansas girl?
she is. She has some roots up in the Northeast, but she's lived in Arkansas most of her life, from very young, and she is works here in Little Rock.
Nice.
Amazing.
Um,
Go ahead, Yoel.
no, I was gonna get back to the legislation, Ben, but I don't know if you
Yeah,
want
I wanted you to bridge back. Go for it.
No, because I was curious, Brian. I mean, you've touched upon it, but again, just to make it simple for our audience. So, somebody's in your situation and they're noticing, something's not right here. This very issue in another state, for example, right? So let's say in a state where the process has not started, like you talked about West Virginia and other places, but somewhere outside of that, and somebody's, listening to this podcast or watching, and they want to make a change. So how does that look? Like, practically speaking, what is somebody's next step?
Well, I think you've got to know what the law currently says, and then to know how to change it. So, you need to be able to understand the code and then make the fine tuning of the code the way we did. And I helped draft and amend what we did, and so we had a lot of lawyers on board helping us. And you need some lawyers that are friendly to your cause to write the code and change it the way you want to, um, and write a good bill. And then after that, you've got to have sponsors willing to fight for it. We had strong sponsors. Our Senator Alan Clark and Representative Jimmy Gazaway are both very strong sponsors. Representative Gazaway is an attorney, so he was um, obviously articulate in the law, and Senator Clark's been a warrior for children's rights in Arkansas for a long time. So we were fortunate to have good sponsors. We had a good ground team that kind of worked the reps and got the support in the legislature, because we kept it kind of quiet. We didn't do a lot of publicity. We didn't do a lot of stuff on Facebook really until the week before the vote, because we didn't want to drum up opposition for one, and we knew that really doesn't, it's not effective to convince legislators. That way you've got to have that FaceTime, sit down and meet with them, explain your bill and why it's important. And we out lobbied most of the paid lobbyists up there, if not all of them, in our volunteer efforts on that one bill. And after that session, all of the legislators told us our bill got more attention than almost any other bill. And there were a lot of controversial bills from Arkansas that session. So we had a lot of work put in, and we had to, because the forces that you're fighting are huge. I mean, you're fighting the judicial the judges, and so you've got the entire judiciary that's going to be against you probably, and then most of the lawyers, particularly the family lawyers. So there's a lot of strong forces there that are going to oppose it, and that's going to be true in Ohio and every other state that tries this,
Right.
because they want to keep doing things the same way, and they don't want to change.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's not kind of, it's pretty disturbing. Like, obviously you can't get into the minds of somebody else, but you mentioned before that nobody's going to say this, but and we're not making any specific allegations of anyone specific, but take a family lawyer, you said before, that doesn't want the bill changed because of the reality that there's a reduction in litigation files. Like, do you think that that's a sort of a conscious reason, or people kind of just justify to themselves and whatnot? Like, do you think there are people out there that would actually fight something, and this is maybe a naive question, but just for the sole reason that I am going to lose business? Could it be that?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. And family lawyers are the bottom dwellers of lawyers. And uh, I'm going to tell you, they are. Um, and I've got some friends.
A family lawyer who's a divorcee himself, but
yeah, and I've got some friends that are, some exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, family lawyers make a living off of the pain and agony that families go through. And if there's not conflict, they're going to try to create that conflict through litigation. And the more conflict they can create, the more money they make. So absolutely, that played a part into it. And I can tell you that the litigation has dropped dramatically in the past year when it comes to child custody cases.
I mean, this is interesting because it's we had a podcast with a family lawyer, hasn't gone live yet, and I definitely have experienced, unfortunately, what you're describing in terms of the approach of I've seen let's just say I've seen what you're describing in family lawyers. At the same time, though, like this family lawyer that we had on our podcast is actually a friend of mine. So, he was talking about the fact that a lot of them work collaboratively to try and sort of bridge the gap. He's from Ontario, Canada. So, Ben was joking. He doesn't know if that's because Canadians are more polite or something like that. I'm a Canadian myself, but isn't it fair to say there are obviously you're speaking in generalities, but there are family lawyers that do have a genuine interest in sort of helping people through their issues as well,
yes.
right? Yeah,
absolutely. There are some exceptions to the rule.
Right.
There are some great family lawyers here in Arkansas that I trust and rely upon. And I'm happy to share those names if anyone's interested. But there are some good ones, and they try to do the right thing. They try to do collaborative law the right way, and try to get a resolution the right way without going to court. So yeah, they do exist, and we were fortunate enough to have a few of them come testify in support of our bill. So we had that support from those that stood up and said, no, this is a good thing, and we need this. And I don't agree with the majority of the bar association. So other states that try this are going to have to find those lawyers willing to stand up like that.
By the way, speaking of those lawyers, a question I've seen a lot is, a lot of men, when they're just starting out, other than getting referrals from other guys or whatever, like what's something, can you speak to, what's something somebody should look for when they're, trying to find somebody to help them, to find a family lawyer? Are there sort of red flags that one should look out for? Because I know a lot of men ask about, how do you choose the right family lawyer?
Yeah. So I would encourage, ask questions like, have you ever represented a mom seeking primary custody? And if so, what were the reasons? Because all the, their cases are public record. Or just ask, what were the cases where you've represented a mom seeking primary custody? and give me those case numbers. And then you can look up those cases and see what that attorney actually filed against the other dad. And some attorneys will file pleadings that are above board and say we really need primary custody in this case because the dad is addicted to drugs or for some other reason, and maybe that was the case. But then I have other attorneys that file pleadings just filled with nonsense and lies, and you can really get a sense of who that person is by reading what they filed in the past. So, I encourage, take some time to do that type of homework, but get a sense of what they've actually done in the past. And then you can also ask, what do you typically, charge, and what's the range? Because if you've got attorneys that are just charging ridiculous amounts of money into the six figures for a custody case, then that should be a red flag as well.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful advice.
Yeah, I never even thought of that. That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
So you have, I don't know, it could be one of our listeners listens to this podcast and they say, hey, I want to get involved. I want to do this in my state. I want to be the spearheader. The people that you work with in your group, do they have connections to other states as well?
I do. I've worked with New Hampshire. I've worked with people in Florida, Missouri. We've had some rumblings in South Carolina, Indiana, trying to think, Minnesota. There's been efforts in the past in a lot of these states to get a rebuttable presumption. They've all failed. And so, it's kind of which state is going to have the appetite and the energy to try to get something done. And so I'm happy to talk to anyone at any time. But at some point, you've got to have boots on the ground in that state to really carry the water.
Is there an organization, nonprofit in your future?
Well, I work with a lot of different nonprofits on the national level. Primarily, I don't know if you're familiar with Greg Ellis, who wrote The Respondent. And if you've not read that book, I encourage you to read it. He's an actor and author out of California that went through a horrible ordeal, but it's really an excellent book for fathers.
Well,
And then
Greg Ellis.
Greg Ellis. The book's called The Respondent, and he has a national nonprofit called Children and Parents United. So that's one that we're working with, that I'm working with directly. And then, of course, we have National Parents Organization is a national nonprofit that works on legislative efforts, and they helped write the bill in Kentucky and the one in West Virginia, I believe. And they had a role in ours as well. Obviously, the Fathers' Rights Movement, I've worked a lot with them. And then Americans for Equal and Shared Parenting, Mark Ludwood's group out of Missouri. So those are all national groups that I've worked with and think highly of. And the way I look at it, we're all on the same team, and the more energy and people we can get involved, the better.
Yeah, that's actually a great list, and we'll link to all of those in the description, and that's a huge help. Have you been in touch with anybody internationally? Because from what I see, just roaming Twitter, there's now like a movement in the UK, and some of their ministers speaking out pretty loudly and vocally about it.
Yeah, I did a podcast, I want to say maybe a year ago, right after we passed our law, and it was an international parental rights podcast, and we had a lot on people on there from the UK and other countries from Europe and South America, and they all wanted to hear about what Arkansas did. And,
Amazing.
but I've not worked with anyone directly in the UK. I've seen, being a member of different um, parental rights groups and dad's rights groups. You see comments from people in the UK and Canada and Australia and other countries, but I've not worked with anyone directly.
And you know, I'd love to like dive into kind of when you were invited to that podcast and you're speaking to all these people and they all want to pick your brain. Like, how does that feel? That you went
Well,
from you went from this horrible experience to now you're like, you know, people are turning to you to get them, you know, out of it.
yeah, I was a little, I don't know, gun shy is the right word, maybe just guarded, because when you start talking about international law, and every nation is different. And so once I get outside of my comfort zone, I get a little guarded, and normally I would just kind of inquire and ask, what does their country currently do? And, how can you try to do something similar to what the US, what we did in Arkansas? And it's amazing to me how different countries and different cultures do something so dramatically different. Because if you look at countries like, Sweden and some other countries that really have progressive parental equality laws, and then some other countries that have very draconian laws, and just even worse than the U.S. or other places. So uh, it's it's very interesting when you think about that, and because the nature of a relationship between a father and a child, or any parent and a child, doesn't change just because you change your boundary in a country. It's just the culture may be different, but it's still the same relationship.
Yeah, I mean, in Israel, where we're based, so there were laws, I believe, that changed in 2016, which is similar to this, where if you're making the same amount of money and there's no issues, 50-50 is the default, and also no support, child support. But it's still not the rule of the land, but officially it is. Um, so there's definitely a change in the air, which is really really good to see. But still the stories of even I don't know if we want to go there, but the guys who get the bum deal and just can't deal with it and commit suicide. Like there are some huge ramifications to the system as it is. It was one of the things that woke me up. I I was going through it and I saw a news story here in Israel where a father had to pay like 3 times his salary as child support, and he couldn't do it, so they put him in jail. And then he went to court to see if he can lower it, and they said no, and he killed himself. And that one shook me to the core. And it's not the only one by far.
No, it's not. I mean, those stories are awful, and I just encourage if you have one viewer, anyone that's watching that's struggling with that issue, reach out, find some help, because it's not worth it. So I encourage any of you to do that. And I've given my cell phone out. I'm happy to visit with anyone at any time, and please, reach out to me. I'm happy to visit. But it's not just suicide. It's you hear stories about custody exchanges and dads getting murdered, like John Mass, and then other stories like that where they're getting gunned down. And then you hear stories about maybe they don't die, but just I mean, if you look at the statistics of the negative effects on health of dads who go through conflict, custody litigation, it is devastating, because you're dealing with stress and anxiety and just a whole list of negative health consequences. You don't eat right, you don't get enough sleep, and so it's important for guys and men to understand that, and recognize, hey, you've got to take care of yourself to be able to take care of your children. And so please do that.
Yeah, very, very well said. Very well said.
Yeah, so I'm so curious where you see this in like 5 years from now.
I kind of have a 5, 10, 20 year, I don't know if you recall in the States when kind of the marijuana laws started happening and they started, you have one state kind of adopt it and then you had others. And, we kind of, um, we want to be that leader, that example, that blueprint, and then other states follow. And hopefully we get a 2, 3 more next year, and then in 5 years maybe we have a handful of states that have done it. In 10 years maybe we have a dozen, and maybe in 20 years half the states have followed what we've done, and that would be amazing.
Uh,
And so
you think it's going to be that slow?
I think it's going to be tough because it's the forces that we're battling against in each state are very tough. So I think you're dealing with a lot of money involved. To be honest, a lot of money involved and a lot of power when it comes to the judiciary and lawyers. So it takes, and we just had the perfect dynamic in Arkansas to get it over the line. And to be honest, if it hadn't aligned with our team and our sponsors the way it did, I don't know that we could have done what we did in Arkansas. So it was a really kind of the stars aligned, and we had a great team, and we just had people that worked, and it's hard to find people that want to work that hard. I tell you, Patrick and his wife Gina, they worked so hard just as volunteer lobbyists to get this done. And they just put in the hours. And so now that every legislator in Arkansas knows who we are, they know our faces when we're at the state capitol, they know what our issue is. And
Right.
so it's, and again, all of the paid lobbyists are, you guys are outworking us. Why? How do you do this? It's because we care. And, we do it because we care about our issue, and we don't want to be a paid lobbyist. We want to be a grassroots lobbyist group who really cares about reform and change.
Good for you. It's amazing. Were you ever concerned about any sort of personal backlash you may face? Like, I don't know if you're in private practice or, whether it's clients or some people you're doing work for who may be on opposite sides of the spectrum. Were you ever concerned about that? And has that impacted you at all in any way on a personal level?
I'd say yes and no. Yes, I was concerned. Just being a lawyer in the Arkansas bar, you don't want to upset other lawyers. It's not generally my nature to do that. But at the same time, I want to do what's right, and I want to do what's best for Arkansas families and Arkansas children. Has it impacted me? No, not really. If anything, it's given me more of a platform to speak about this issue. And my private practice is so disconnected from this issue; it really has no bearing on my private practice. So I've continued to do what I do without any retribution.
That's amazing.
Do you think politics are in your future?
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I've been asked to run for legislative office in Arkansas, and maybe down the road 10 plus years I'll consider it. But right now we have 5 kids between the ages of 5 and 12. So
Wow.
we're going to basketball games, and I'm about to be coaching a t-ball baseball team. So
Nice.
You're amazing, Brian. And by the way, have you always been that type of personality, like passionate and driven? Like, has there been anything else that you can recall where you've had so much, passion to make a change in any other area you can think of, or this is kind of been something that really stands out for you in your life of really putting your full force behind?
Um, I think this would probably take the cake. Um, yeah, I mean, I've always been passionate about issues when I get involved, and I like to argue and make my point. That's why I became a lawyer, and I thought about being a teacher. And I've actually taught at our law school, and I really enjoy teaching at the law school.
Cool.
It's kind of one of my side gigs that I don't get paid for, and I just like to do.
Amazing.
But the book that I read when I was in college and really convinced me to become a lawyer was Michael Crichton's Disclosure. And if you've not read that,
Okay.
that's the book about sexual harassment, and
I
had the
read that
movie with
too.
yeah,
Yeah,
Michael Douglas and
yeah.
Demi Moore. And so that's what got me interested in kind of Title VII discrimination type litigation, and that led me to law school. But I've always been passionate. I've always had energy to when something's not right, um, to call it out, and I've never shied away from that.
And is that
Awesome.
something you instill in your children as well? Like, do you speak about these things or just try and lead by example, or both?
Mostly lead by example. I mean, I encourage them to have a strong sense of fairness
Mm.
and equality and justice. And I think those are good principles to have. And certainly, I think they have them, and to varying degrees. Certainly, my daughter is much more empathetic and sensitive than my boys, but they all have their attributes and strong characteristics.
Beautiful.
So on that note, we love to have our guests share their too dad to quit moment. That moment where they were like, I'm a dad, I'm doing the dad thing, and I could not be prouder. And you just feel like you're the coolest guy in the world. If these moments happen all the time, if we would love for you to share one of those moments with us.
Oh wow, yeah. I mean, let me think about that one. That's a tough one. I've had some really good moments with all three of my children and my stepchildren. Um, I think family vacations are always fun, and we've tried to, rather than go real crazy with material presents at Christmas and birthdays, try to invest that money for memories and do trips instead. So we do kind of big trips for us, whether that's to the beach or Great Wolf Lodge or
Nice.
St. Louis, and then my two older ones I've taken to recently New York City and DC, and so kind of building those experiences and watching them see things for the first time, like the Lincoln Memorial or the Statue of Liberty or the Arch in St. Louis,
Yeah.
Mm.
Coolest
things like
elevator, by
that.
the way.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That elevator is insane. So for anybody who hasn't been to St. Louis and been to the Arch, basically the elevator is like an egg shape, and it just goes up to the left, up to the left, up to the left, and you're in it, and you're like, what the heck is going on? But and then
Yeah.
you get up to the top, and the thing is, like, if it's windy, it's swaying in the wind while you're up there.
Yes,
It's
it is an
really cool.
experience. So I think those moments collectively, when they look at me and say, this is cool, this is a neat experience, and you kind of make that bonding moment, share that moment, and even if it's just like I said, I love fishing and putting them in the John boat, and we're out there just me and them, and you know having that moment as the sun sets. Those you don't have to spend a lot of money to have those moments, but you can have those moments with just out fishing.
Beautiful.
100%. And the last thing we'd like to leave our listeners with is, you've been through it, you've started over, you know, you've gone the whole gamut, I would say. You know, marriage, divorce, marriage, kids, stepkids, you got a big spectrum there. Any advice you would give to our listeners that are going through it, thinking about doing it? Not sure, 20% of our listeners are actually women, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And I hear from the feedback is they just want to hear the other side. And I think, them seeing what it's like after from a guy's perspective, I think has great value. If they're considering it, especially, there's 70% of the women. If we stop 20%, I'll be happy. So any advice you have there?
Wow. Advice. There's a lot of things I would have done differently. You can always Monday morning quarterback.
Yeah.
But to be honest, a lot of the way I look at it is that, I went through it because it made me better. And I wouldn't be who I am today, and probably wouldn't be as passionate about the issue had I not gone through it. So, what I would say is, realize that you're not going to do everything perfect. You're not going to do everything correctly. And if you're always trying to do your best and trying to do what's best for your children, usually in the end, it's going to work out some way or another. And even if it just seems like there's no hope, there's always hope. So don't give up and just keep trying. From a litigation standpoint, I would say just try to always take the high road and just don't feed into any baiting of conflict. I think a lot of dads get trapped in taking that bait and engaging in that conflict and it being used against them to their disadvantage. So try to take the high road and just, if there's going to be an argument, or just walk away and come back to it another time.
Very wise words.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for coming.
Take the time,
Before you
Rob.
leave,
Yeah.
it was amazing. Before you do leave,
thank you, guys.
we want to remind everybody, we want to share your story. toodadtoquit.com, toodadtoquit on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and wherever you can find us, we are there. We want to hear your story. Please reach out. Again, as you can see, everybody has a different story to tell. And if you do need, or you're interested in moving things forward in your state, please reach out to Brian. He would happy to help. And we're really happy that you had the time to take for us. And,
thanks so much, Brian. Great meeting you.
Honored to be with you guys. You guys stay in touch, and happy to visit anytime.
Thank you for listening to the Too Dad to Quit podcast. Available at toodadtoquit.com. Thanks for listening, and don't